Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. I'm Robert Guest, I'm the foreign editor of The Economist, and we're here to talk about one of the big issues in Europe. Who gets to live here? Who gets to work here? And how does everyone get along with each other? I'm going to start by asking my distinguished panel each to introduce themselves very briefly, and then we're going to get stuck straight in. So perhaps if we start from the far left, or my stage left.
Yes, my name is August Hanning. I have a security background. I was head of the German Foreign Intelligence Service, and then afterwards Deputy Minister of the Interior in Germany, and at that time responsible for all the problems of what we are discussing now, refugees and all the other problems of internal security. And now I'm a lawyer and a consultant.
I'm Parag Khanna. I'm the other half of the Berlin faction, though I don't sound like it. I'm a fellow at the Robert Bosch Academy in Berlin, and normally, though, based at the Lee Kuan Yew School in Singapore, and previously I've worked in American think tanks and in the US Defense Department.
My name's Elizabeth Collett. I'm the director of the Migration Policy Institute Europe, which is a Brussels-based independent think tank dedicated to the study of migration. So in that regard, I'm a one-trick pony, and most of the last few years has been spent dealing with the immediate effects of the changes in migration flow we saw in Europe over the last 2 or 3 years, and now looking at what that means in the longer term.
I'm Syed Kamal. I'm one of the members of the European Parliament for London, and in the European Parliament, I lead the European Conservatives and Reformists Group, which is the third largest of the 8 political pan-European political groups. Most of my work is really in Parliament is mostly about trade issues and also financial regulation. And in London, I do a lot of work on community-led solutions to tackling poverty.
And I'm Paul Collier. I'm an economist at Oxford. And my last 2 books, this year, Refuge was about the global refugee problem. Before that, Exodus was about the effects of international migration, both on host countries and on countries of origin.
Excellent. Well, let's start with you, Paul. One can divide migrants into 2 types: the ones who leave home voluntarily, and the ones who leave home involuntarily. And we've had a lot of both sorts in Europe. Thinking from a European perspective, which of those groups should we be more concerned about at the moment?
Well, I mean, as David Miliband, you weren't here to hear David Miliband at lunchtime, but what he outlined was both his book, which has just come out, and my book, which came out 6 months before. And what he said was, refugees are not migrants. It's very important, right? Refugees are not migrants. They are, by definition, the people who chose to stay in their homes, to stay in their home country, and parts of that home country have become unsafe, hopefully temporarily, and so they're displaced. So David very properly started from 65 million people displaced from their homes, of which 20 million stagger over the nearest border, and they're nearly all in the regional havens. Only a tiny proportion come to Europe. Everything that Europe touches, it turns into something about Europe.
Yes.
It's nothing. Europe
I don't think we're the only continent that sees the world that way, but yeah,
Europe is a complete sideshow, and European refugee policy, taking refugees, is a complete sideshow. What we failed to do with refugees was actually help the refugees in the haven countries when the crisis in Syria began. We just neglected our duty of rescue, and then we paid the consequence. Then we lurched from the heartless head to the headless heart with nothing in between. Then we lurched back to the heartless head, of course.
Can I bring in Syed here? And yet, so refugee policy, as Professor Collier says, is, Europe is marginal to the world of refugees, yet refugees are not marginal to European politics. They've driven a great deal of the election rhetoric in a number of countries, including ones that have hardly taken any refugees at all, like Poland. How would you summarise the effect that the refugee crisis has had on European politics?
Well, I think one of the big problems when you look at, say, Merkel's, what is seen as Merkel's invitation for people to come into Germany was that a mistake was made right at the beginning, that there was no clear distinction made between people who were genuinely seeking asylum and seeking refuge and leaving dangerous homes, and those who wanted to come to better their lives, understandably coming for a better life as economic migrants. And it all got rather confused. And actually, had we tackled that straight away in terms of processing wherever we process, whether nearer to their homes or once they cross the sea, then actually I think there would have been more trust in the system. And I think what's happened by merging asylum and immigration, and in fact, it's very interesting in Brussels, if I talk about illegal immigrants, people say you can't say that. You can't say illegal, you have to call them irregular immigrants or irregular migrants because they're not actually committing a crime. That means that the sanction of which is to go to jail. But put that aside, the whole issue is that people have lost trust. And what happens when you merge everything is that immigration and asylum become black and white. We've either got too many people or actually it doesn't really matter, we need these people. Rather than the shades of grey in between, asking what do we need, both in terms of migrants in our country, and what skills do we need to fill that can't be filled by the indigenous population. And secondly, what do we do to help those people genuinely facing danger in their home country? And that's all got lost in the European debate.
Elizabeth, do you think that the debate in Europe has been honest on this topic? And where do you think it's been better and worse? Or is it pretty much the same everywhere?
I mean, there are certainly places where the debate has been worse. I mean, we've heard language I don't think we've heard in Europe for quite some time becoming mainstream in certain countries, particularly in Central Europe. I think the debate got mischaracterized very early on, the sense of crisis, the idea that it's a European crisis, and whether that is really the central point. It became very quickly an existential crisis for the European Union's ability to solve problems that was centered around the idea that borders are either open or they're closed. And we quickly fixated on that as being, are we letting people through the Western Balkans? Are we stopping people from the Western Balkans coming from Greece to the rest of Europe? Talking about that as the core issue that was defining the European Union. Anyone who works on immigration policy or anyone who works in security policy, and regardless of what area you work in, understands that borders are never open or closed. They are managed. And you make decisions, you identify people, you register, you decide whether someone has a claim for asylum, for example, or not. You decide whether someone has a legitimate means of entry or not. And as a caveat, we should always bear in mind that the vast majority of people arriving in Europe at any given moment have a legitimate means of entry. When we talk about irregular arrivals, that still is a very small proportion of the total. And we have forgotten that within Europe, that our borders do tend to be managed. It created a polarization in the debate where a large number of people who usually sat in the middle were forced to choose whether they wanted to be humanitarians and talk about open borders or authoritarians and talk about closed borders. It really pushed that polarization. And speaking as a think tank that likes to sit in the middle, we find ourselves in quite a lonely place by saying, well, both of these things can be true. You can be humanitarian while enforcing rules. We've lost that part of the debate in many levels, at European level, national level, and I think we have to regain that nuance back into debate. It's difficult when it's so politicized, and it's difficult when it's being utilized by so many populist and other parties to achieve alternative goals that may be anti-European, they may be anti-immigrant. So I think one of the things we have to do is step back and regain that perspective. In terms of the more positive things, I do think we have had a more positive conversation on integration in some countries across the EU, particularly Germany, a country that decided early, these people are here, let's work on integration and let's invest in that and not worry about whether we should or shouldn't, just let's dive in. And communities around Germany and elsewhere have been very positively innovating in that regard. So there are good spots to this, but we have become beholden to our own mischaracterizations.
But it's become a sort of monumental topic in a way that it wasn't sort of 15 years ago, and it's driven elections. You know, it's driven Britain to make a sort of, you know, gigantic reversal of the constitutional arrangements of the past generation or so in a way that will lead us, gosh knows where. It's led to Angela Merkel not losing power, but losing a lot of power in Germany. It led to quite a frightening presidential race in France, where ultimately the pro-globalization candidate won, but there was a point where people thought Marine Le Pen might have done, and she was wrapping up anti-immigration stuff with very anti-EU stuff as well. She was threatening to do things such as withdrawing from the single currency that could have really torn the European Union apart. And of course, you're seeing it across the Atlantic in America, where a large part of Donald Trump's extraordinary political success was based on his promise to build a wall and make Mexico pay for it, which is an extraordinary thing to promise, given that nobody seriously thought that that was possible, and yet it won him an election. If I can turn to Parag. So you're living in Berlin at the moment. You're at the epicenter of the welcome culture. How would you say that's played out in Germany?
Well, clearly they have a more, you could say progressive, as Elizabeth also pointed, it's a country that has a more constructive dialogue around it. It obviously has been polarizing, there's no doubt. If you look at, for example, the standing of the AfD, Alternative für Deutschland Party, prior to the refugee sort of influx versus after, it's obviously been a major issue in the politics. On the other hand, I think what's pragmatic about it is that they're thinking also in terms of supply and demand. I mean, they realize that even though Germany's fertility rates are not as bad as other countries in Europe, there is a sense that they do need immigrants in a variety of sectors in the economy. Now, I don't think that they or any other European country has done a very good job of matching up the inflow of migrants in the general or the specific, into the sectors. They need to do a better job of that. That's something they're working on. But I do think it's part of the conversation to say, if they're here, let's focus on how we can integrate them. So you see industry stepping up and trying to integrate immigrants based on the skills that they have into certain jobs. You see that actually a lot of jobs have now been created in the social sector in terms of assimilation. You can, on a personal level, when you're walking around, you actually see this yearning amongst new arrivals to learn German, and I think anyone who's studied immigration policy knows very well, especially in the European context, that that language is absolutely critical. So the earlier you can really work on linguistic assimilation, the Dutch, for example, have had a good constructive or progressive policy around this for a long time, the more likely you are to have a better integrated set of people. So I think that also universities, academic institutions are getting involved in Germany and figuring out how they can utilize new migrants. So I think that all European countries do have to think about this from the point of view of who is it that they need. This is something that Syed was also saying. How can they just better utilize the skill sets and make it part of their economy and use those rational arguments that I'm sure Elizabeth's organization has been making for many years about how important it is actually for the economic health of a society to have more migrants. So I think hopefully with the stability that seems to have been restored in the German political landscape, at least, that will continue. I also think that the U.S. will eventually turn around as well. And it's not that Trump represents the majority of the national sentiment. As we all know very well, he does no such thing. One of the things that really struck me about the U.S. Political season over a 2-year period of the presidential campaign was that there was this enormous focus on this hypothetical wall on the Mexican border to stop a couple of thousand or whatever number of illegal crossings every year. At no point did I hear in this 2-year period, 2 years we had for someone to say that, or to ask the question, and to this day I think Americans don't even know the answer to this, though they should. How many legal crossings are there between the US and Canada every year and the US and Mexico every year? Just take a guess. I would hope that someone on this panel would know the answer.
A lot.
Someone in the audience? Well, these are the 2 busiest borders on the planet Earth, and they always will be. We're talking about 50 million crossings between the United States and Mexico every single year, right? And 30 million, I think, between the US and Canada. And that's legitimate, legal, annual border crossings, right? That one presumes are to some mutual benefit commercially or otherwise. No one bothered to point that out. It's all about the hypothetical few thousand people who are digging tunnels and coming over the border. What about the literally 80 million people legally crossing those 2 borders every single year? And if you don't quantify it, you don't put that number out there, then people aren't going to appreciate that fact.
Well, I mean, you've got a lot of people, down in San Diego who will cross the border 2-3 times a day, every day, or they'll commute to work from the Mexican side of the border and go to the American side, and then they'll go back again in the evening. And this doesn't bother anyone in San Diego.
Oh, and again, if they're doing it for business purposes, right, they're presumably enhancing both economies to some degree. And yet, again, it's as if we talk about whether it's the Mexican wall or Trump's, anti-immigrant policy, as if it's somehow reflective of some kind of new conventional wisdom. But of course, the purpose of governance is to do more than, obviously poison national consciousness and then ride that to election victory. It's actually to come up with a policy that's beneficial for your country. And it's obviously not clear that that's the policy that the US is pursuing.
August, you've been looking at this from a security perspective as a former head of intelligence in Germany. How big a worry is this in Germany, in Europe?
Yes, the German security agencies, intelligence, the domestic agency and the law enforcement agency have not been very happy because in 2015 and 2016 entered more than 1.3 million migrants or refugees, however you want, the German borders without, many of them, 80%, they don't have any identity paper, without any control, they enter Germany. And that is, of course, for every law enforcement organizations or police forces, it's a nightmare because you don't know who is entering your country. And internal security, of course, has something to do with border control. And we are a member of the Schengen system. And in former times, and when I was in the Chancellery, we have negotiated the Schengen system. And the promise to the German public always was, if we are entering the Schengen system, we will have the same security on behalf of border control than afterwards. And then we saw that there was a completely breakdown of the border control in Greece and in other places of Europe. And that was, of course, a problem and is still a problem. What we need really, and that was the hope in Germany, we need a European perspective, we need a European solution. But of course, Mrs. Merkel has made her decision without consultation, but of course it was a very difficult situation, I have to admit. But afterwards, we have faced strong resistance against this kind of policy in the eastern part of Europe. There has been a European decision to distribute the migrants or refugees, but the East European nations strictly neglected this decision. And we see now that we are getting a lot of migrants, refugees from other European countries coming to Germany. We have month by month 15,000 new asylum seekers in Germany, many of them coming from other European countries. And I think in the long run, we have a very serious problem, not only in Germany, in Europe. How should we deal with all these problems? We have very different views in the eastern part of Europe and the western part of Europe. We in Germany, we have, I think, yes, try to achieve a real immigration policy. We don't have a real immigration policy in Germany. In the past, we saw ourselves, we are not an immigration country, and therefore we don't have an immigration policy. And other politicians in Germany, especially the Green parties, they saw we are a multicultural country. But I think in the long run, this is not very helpful, because immigration means that you have to learn the language, that you have to accommodate to the situation in the host country. Again, I think now we have a very serious discussion after the elections. It's not very easy. We need a new government. You have mentioned it. But again, one of the really huge challenges for Germany is an immigration policy. And all over Europe, we have to find a solution, because we see the constant pressure of migrants coming from Africa, coming from Central Asia, from Afghanistan to Germany. It have been not only people from Syria, okay, understandable, but we got a lot of people from countries like Tunisia, Morocco, and Algeria, and other safe places for economic reasons. And therefore, again, I think that is one of the really big challenges for Europe. How should we deal in the future with this pressure from refugees coming to Europe?
Do you think that German immigration policy will actually change under the new government, when you get a government?
We have already changed our immigration policy. I think Mrs. Merkel, not publicly, but in fact, we have changed our law. And the Balkan route is closed now, more or less. There are coming still refugees via the Balkany towards Europe. But again, we have changed, and I guess we will change. And again, we hope that we could find a common solutions all over Europe. I think that's our hope in Germany.
Let me switch the topic slightly to sort of business and economics. Now, I'll lay my cards on the table. Where I'm coming from at The Economist, we're very pro-migration, both philosophically and as a practical matter. You know, we're a British-based but global magazine, and we try to explain the world to the world, which means we have to hire a lot of people who are not British, because 85% of our customers are not British. And immigration policy is a huge pain for us. You know, I'm constantly trying to hire people who are American or Indian, and it takes months and months and months to get permission, and they get refused on all kinds of footling grounds. And then with Brexit, you know, my deputy is Filipino-Italian. My number 3 is Irish. My Africa editor is sort of German-South African. None of them's really sure whether they'll be, what their migration status will be in a few years' time, whether they'll be allowed to stay in the country. And so the atmosphere where I am swirls with stories of bureaucratic obstruction. One colleague was describing how his wife was applying for British citizenship, and she's someone who's a doctor who works in the NHS. She used to do psychological consultancy for people who are traumatized by combat. And a lot of the time, her job consisted of trying to get veterans of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan into a place where they didn't want to kill themselves. So quite a useful job. And she was told that she had violated her immigration status in the country because she had changed her job. And she said, well, I didn't change my job. I've been doing the same job for 15 years. But what had happened was that the unit within the NHS that she was working for had changed its name. So while she continued to do the same incredibly useful job, the immigration people decided that she was a cheat and a violator and so on. And this is the kind of stuff that people deal with. It takes time, it takes money, it slows down, every globally facing business in the country. And yet, there is another side to it, and I'll turn to Professor Collier here. Who do you think is winning and losing economically from what's happening with Brexit?
Yeah, Robert, you did sound, when you were talking about how much The Economist benefited from immigration, what came into my mind was, you remember the old General Motors comment, what's good for General Motors is good for the USA.
Yes, I didn't say that about The Economist, and I wouldn't dream of saying it, but as an illustration.
It's how, there's clearly a divergence between the business interest and the interest of the people in the society. You've got to face that, right? And the government has a duty to run the country in the interest of the people here, right? I mean, you talk about ethics, the Economist philosophy, let me give you 3 philosophies, and you tell me which you want, right? Okay. So one is the libertarian philosophy, which says people should be free to do whatever they want, regardless of the consequences for others, right? You want that one?
Yeah, libertarians.
Actually, that's not libertarian.
Libertarians wouldn't say regardless of the consequences.
As long as it didn't impinge on the liberty of others.
Okay, but you wouldn't
as long as it doesn't cause direct provable harm to other people.
Control borders, basically. A libertarian would say any control on borders is interference with personal liberty. Or you could do a utilitarian thing. Mm-hmm. The paternalistic state, run by the Platonic guardians, has a duty to maximize global utility, irrespective of what the people in the country think. Right? Mm-hmm. Or you could take a communitarian view of ethics and say, actually, what is a society? It's a system of reciprocal obligations that people painfully build, And the government is both the expression of that reciprocal obligations and a duty to run in their interests, right? I'm number 3. You sound as if the Economist is either number 1 or number 2, or some funny combination between. So I just don't think there's an ethical basis for saying we can ignore the interest of the people in the country, and it's not coincident with business, right?
Do you mean the interest of the people or the opinion of the people? Because
it's not in the interest of people in the country to have unrestricted immigration.
Yeah, but that is a little bit of a straw man, because unrestricted immigration doesn't exist anywhere in the world. And you
so you're
could
in favour of restricted immigration?
The way I would answer that is, ultimately, the world would be a better place if we could get to a stage where immigration was completely unrestricted. As a pragmatic matter at the moment, that's not going to happen and would probably cause a bunch of wars, which would be obviously very bad. It is, however, the case that, certainly within the European Union, there is no reason why you can't have unrestricted movement between EU members. They're all roughly the same level of development, give or take a factor of 2 or 3.
IMF study showing that the migration of people from Eastern Europe into, I guess, Germany, has actually retarded development in Eastern Europe, right? It's been good for the migrants, but it's been bad for the people left behind who've chosen to stay behind in Eastern Europe. Now, it's been good for Germany, it's been good for the migrants, it's been bad for the people left behind, right? We ought to factor that in. Right?
But I'd be curious to know the basis of that argument. If you think about the incorporation of new European countries into the European Union, you had so much industry move from Germany to places like Poland. How could those people be worse off today?
That was integrating into trade and investment, not opening borders for people, right? There's a difference. Globalization isn't one big package, it's several different components. And economics doesn't even use the term globalization, right? The movement of factors of production, labor and capital, has very, very different normative implications from trade. Trade, comparative advantage. Labor and capital, absolute advantage. Trade must be mutually beneficial for both societies. Movements of factors, no reason to think they're mutually beneficial.
There's a couple of interesting divides here. One is how much weight you apply to the interests of people and places. And I think we all agree that the migrants benefit enormously from moving, otherwise they wouldn't uproot themselves from the places they're moving to. And we mean migrants, not refugees here. And the benefits of that appear to be so staggeringly large if you're moving certainly from a poor country to a rich country, that it is presumably possible that you could come to some political arrangement where, instead of saying, we don't want this to happen because we don't like it, we'd say there is, okay, now the one back of the envelope calculation I'm going to quote is that you could double global GDP if everyone had free movement, which is obviously a very long run prediction. But if you've got that kind of money on the table, right, are you going to leave that on the table, or are you going to come to some kind of arrangement whereby you say, well, actually, yeah, we'll allow a certain amount of migration and we'll take some of the benefits from that?
I think the challenge is that how do you get to an immigration system in which the majority of people trust? And at the moment, I think it's just genuinely a lack of trust in the immigration system. And it's very interesting, during the referendum, I went around giving talks, given the 8 arguments for leave, 8 arguments for remain, and discussing the arguments, because I got fed up with both campaigns. I just thought they were just as bad as each other, if you like. And what was very interesting, what came through, was there were the different splits. One split was Londoners on the whole and other metropolitan areas quite relaxed about freedom of movement from the EU, cheaper nannies, wider talent pool from Europe. But actually, outside London, you go to the one factory towns, and you met people there who had not seen an increase in their living standards for the last 10 years. They had a porter cabin in their children's school playground, and also they couldn't get an appointment at their local hospital. Now, that was a complete difference. So when you talk about people and businesses, the people in those places felt left behind. Now, how do you challenge that? Now, I always argue for a fair immigration system, But how do you achieve a fair immigration system? There are three ways.
I don't think anyone's against a fair
Well, actually,
immigration system. They just don't agree on what that means.
Actually, well, exactly. Well, how do you define it? So you either let no one in, that would be fair, but none of us would say that. You either let everyone in, but what you find when you almost have an open door policy, we almost had an open door policy in the early Blair years. And actually, one of the Blair's advisors actually said we had an open door because we wanted to rub the right's nose in multiculturalism. What you find is that left of centre voters cross that very thin line between socialism and national socialism and end up voting for national socialist parties. So you found a lot of Labour voters in this country voting BNP in the north of this country. You find communist voters and socialist voters voting for the Front National in France. And therefore, actually, now, if you're a white liberal, you go, great, I can go and protest against these nasty people. But actually, if you're Jewish or you've got dark skin, you are terrified to live in a country where there is a rise of those national socialist parties. So the third option is to have a system where you treat everyone outside your country equally, whether they're from India or Italy, Austria, Australia, Croatia, or Caribbean. And in the EU, we did not have that system. The UK in the EU did not have a fair immigration system. You were given priority to people from other EU countries, most of whom happened to be white, and you were putting up barriers and controls against people from outside the EU, most of whom happened to have dark skin. So effectively, within the EU, we had a racist immigration system. Now, my hope is once we leave, we can treat everyone equally outside the UK, whether they are from the EU or from outside the EU. Now, by definition, because we're next door to the EU, I suspect we'll still get most of our migrants from the EU, but at least that will be a fairer system.
Well, you're saying let's treat everyone equally. What you're actually saying is let's draw the borders in a different place. Let's define the boundaries within which we treat everyone outside them equally differently. And you're saying rather than doing that as the EU, you want to do it as Britain. Logically, you could do it as London or Scotland or Northern Ireland. If
Slightly differently. I'm saying, I think to order to get trust in the immigration system, people have to feel there's some sort of control. And at the moment, they feel that there is control to people outside the EU, but no control to people inside the EU. And therefore, in order to get a fair system, you've got to show that you let people in, you work out where the skills gaps are, you work out how can you get the long-term unemployed back to work. But even if you can't get all of those back to work, you clearly need migrants in this country. But let's stop giving priority to white Europeans over non-white non-Europeans.
So you mean stop?
No, treat everyone equally. Have a control system, we let people in.
Elizabeth, would you like to jump in here?
There is so much to unpack, I don't even know where to start. I mean, I think, your analogy of sort of EU free movement by dint of being regional is thus racist, ignores a huge diversity within Europe, but it also ignores the fact that ECOWAS has an area of free movement, that ASEAN is trying to promote free movement, and presumably has a strong ethnic bias within those two
but sure,
regions.
we don't have to be part of that.
But it depends on where you sit and which
So I would say it's
region you sit
racist,
in.
you wouldn't say it's racist.
I would say it depends on the population you're working within. It's about geographical regions rather than talking about ethnicity.
Yeah, I've heard that quite a few years, yeah.
But when we're talking about free movement and the idea of control versus loss of control, I mean, I think a great deal of the debate over free movement in the UK stems from the fact that the British government mismanaged free movement and didn't utilize the rules it had available to it when it had the chance.
Yeah.
And I mean that in several ways. I mean in terms of overestimating the economic benefits and underestimating the social impacts, and particularly when it comes to public services. But also, I live in Belgium as a UK national. I know exactly, I had to register within 3 weeks and I had my ID card. I am tightly controlled within that situation. And if I lost my job or when I wasn't economically active, there would be questions asked. The failure of the idea of loss of control in the UK is particular to the way the UK decided to do this, and still does it. And I am not convinced that post-Brexit, the UK will be any better at managing these things because it has such poor data management and such poor control over someone once they've entered the borders. There will be very little gain in terms of border control post-Brexit. The EU already has almost all the UK has almost all it needs in terms of border management. It's never participated in Schengen. It's never participated in EU migration policy, and only asylum policy insofar as it added value to the UK. It's never been part of that. I was part of the balance of competences review with the best job title I've ever had, which was external challenger. And there really wasn't much to say when it came to the balance of competences review in the UK government on EU policy, on immigration and asylum, because we didn't really opt into that much. So very little will change there. The big change will be watching the UK build the bureaucracy for an immigration system that it has not done for about 15 years and is not, I believe, currently thinking about. There will be an enormous amount of work to do. It will require some quite deep, I think, philosophical changes in the way we can talk about identity and registration and data collection in the UK. So I'm not sure that ending free movement will increase people's sense of control. It will increase a short-term serotonin hit of feeling like we have more control. But in the long term, it may not realize those effects. And I think there has to be much stronger thinking about how immigration is managed to the EU without getting sort of hung up on the neuroses of free movement and the neurotic debate I think we've managed to find ourselves in over the last 10 years. I'm
going to invite questions from the audience very shortly. So if you want to think about anything that you might like to ask any of the panel, please do. But first, I'm going to ask Parag. You, until recently, lived in Singapore. Do you think we've got anything to learn from the way they handle immigration?
Well, there's a very clear tiered structure, right, which is very transparent, whether it's permanent residency, employment passes, and so forth. And so I think everyone knows where they belong in the system. And other countries have tried to look at models like that, places that are receiving lots of new immigrants, like the United Arab Emirates, for example, which is reaching 10 million people or so over a very short period of time. But they haven't been nearly as clear in that structure. There's still a bit of arbitrariness, whereas in Singapore it is quite clear. Now they did have a backlash. They went through this in their 2011 election or 2012, a couple of years before I moved there. But there was a clear sense that because the population had grown by 1 million, so from 4 million to 5 million, over less than a decade, mostly mainland Chinese and Indian, that infrastructure was under stress and so forth. And so, in fact, this was the time when the Labour Party won, a whopping 7 or 8 seats, in the parliament there.
Which, and by Singapore standards, is a lot for the opposition
huge, right?
to
It was
win.
considered a landslide defeat, even though, of course, the PAP still held 90% of the seats. But the point is that the people spoke, right? And immigration policy changed overnight. And it became very difficult for people to come in there. And it still is more difficult than it was before. And they want to have a very, very controlled now increase in the population. But here's the interesting, here's the process. Brexit is not the beginning or the end, right? What the society is learning now is that there still is an equal number of voices who never wanted those migration restrictions that actually prevailed in that election from 6 or 7 years ago. Because if you go on the street, walk along the street that I live on or any other street in the town, you'll find that restaurants can't even open because they don't have enough staff. They just don't have enough waiters, waitresses. Hotels don't have enough, cleaning staff and all this kind of stuff. Those are ordinary day-to-day Singaporeans too. Those are ordinary business owners. They were never for these immigration restrictions. And already we see from Brexit, I wouldn't know this if I hadn't seen on the front page of the Financial Times, but you already know that there are social sectors, there are quite a few sectors of the British economy that are hurting now already because of these effects of Brexit. So I think we should be thinking a lot more, medium to long term about what's going to be beneficial for the everyday citizens. And it isn't clear that simply restricting migration is the right answer, because way too many sectors of the economy are dependent on immigration.
Yes, I recall the time when my first child was born in a British hospital where a large proportion of the midwives were from West Africa. And there was a particularly fine Ghanaian midwife who said to my wife afterwards, quite loudly, "You don't scream much for a white woman." Which, anyway, I was very glad for the fact that the baby was all fine and all that sort of thing. Singapore is an interesting example because there's no majority ethnic group. And it's a very small and very tightly regulated.
The Chinese are...
Well, actually, it's 70% Chinese.
70% Chinese.
65, 70% Chinese.
Okay,
but it's very diverse. It is the most diverse country in the world, pretty much.
You caught me in error.
It's got
Bow to
every
your
other
superior knowledge
there.
But there's, it's tightly regulated, and there's an assumption that they're going to let in people with skills and be pretty careful about everyone else. You have sort of different policies in the Gulf states, right, where you have the minority ethnic group in, say, you know, any part of the United Arab Emirates is Arab, and they're the citizens, and they're only 10% of the population, and they bring in non-citizens to do the work, and there's a very clear division. They say, you can come here, you can work, you will never, ever, ever be citizens, but you will earn more money than you did at home. And the locals are okay with that. And the migrants, well, often they're not treated very well, but they keep coming. So clearly, they prefer that to the alternative. Paul, what do you think, as a man who's looked at lots of different immigration systems? What are the principles that we should...
First, let me build on what Elizabeth said, which was extremely sensible, that Britain's sort of uniquely weird in not having any behind-the-border control system. The only country in Europe that doesn't have a controlled habitation, you know, you register where you live. We're the only country in Europe that doesn't have a contributory welfare system. It's based on need, not contributions. And so we've just torn, there was an implicit understanding that it was based on reciprocity, but it isn't in practice. I was just in Belgium last week because I was getting a Belgian Citizenship Award from the cooperative movement. And the cooperative movement in Belgium has been desperately trying to work with all the immigrants they've got from Morocco, wherever, you know. And they say, we try and talk to them about getting a job in Belgium, sending their kids to school. She said, they just don't want to hear. They won't listen. The only thing they want to do is get to Britain. Why? Because they can then disappear. They can get a job without, below the radar screen. They can stay in a community that's, de facto. My wife is Dutch. When she goes to the Dutch embassy in London to renew her passport, everybody else in that embassy is Dutch Somali. There's 300,000 Somalis, I think, Dutch Somalis in Britain. Why are they here? Precisely because, I forget who was saying, but the Dutch had done an attempt to get people to learn Dutch. Mm-hmm. And rather than that, people just, no, we don't want to integrate into the Netherlands. We want to come here. Don't have to do anything. So we've got a weird behind-the-border system here. And as Elizabeth said, it's really, Brexit is irrelevant to that. The controls at the border are neither here nor there. It's what you do behind the border. And Britain's just off the map, weird.
It's interesting. My father came to Britain in the 50s when there was clearly a need, and Britain was going out to its former colonies asking for workers to come. And he came here, worked on the railways, then as a bus driver. But he always used to say to me that the greatest thing about Britain is how tolerant it is. Probably the most tolerant, I would argue, one of the most tolerant countries in the world, certainly the most tolerant country in the EU. When I talk to taxi drivers in other cities in the EU, when I tell them I'm from London, they go, you're incredibly lucky. I have a cousin or a friend there, I want to come there. So I think it's two reasons. One is the lack of control, which I agree with. But secondly is actually we are just seen as more tolerant. We have 300 languages in London. And I speak to drivers in Brussels, I speak to North African, I speak French and Arabic, I speak to drivers in Strasbourg, most of them have to be North African, I speak to drivers in cities in Germany I go to. And I said, you're really lucky. London is far more tolerant than any city in my country. But also, my father used to say to me that the worst thing about Britain is that we are too tolerant. Mm. And the interesting thing, I think I agree with both previous panelists who said, we never really had this requirement to learn English for a start. And now we've got the citizenship test. And now the real, I think, challenge for those of us who are more libertarian-minded is that when governments have tried to bring in ID cards, they have had to back down because their party members or the voters have made it quite clear they don't want this control. But at the same time, the public are also complaining about lack of control.
The public complain about lack of control, but they also have a sort of inherent dislike of the idea that a policeman might come up to you and ask to see your papers when you're walking down the street, which happens in many other countries. Yeah. Would anyone in the audience like to raise a hand and ask a question? Otherwise, we're very happy to carry on talking. But would anything... Yes, sir. If you can... There's a microphone heading up behind you. If you can introduce yourself and then ask a question, that'd be great, please.
Hello, good afternoon, Arnold Tamarov. What I've missed in this discussion is a reflection on the causes of migration, both in terms of the causes for refugees and for the causes of economic migration. And if we look at Europe as the largest group of countries that have an open and free society, and we've chosen that this is the way we want to live in, any threat to that will cause instability, and migration and refugees cause a lot of instability in Europe. So what I've missed in the discussion is what are the reasons and who has an interest in creating instability, and where will this lead? Can we think from the end, what is the end of this migration discussion? Because we would want to be open for all of Africa to migrate to Europe and to Germany. And how can this economic disadvantage be addressed? Do all the refugees and migrants want to permanently leave their homes? And how can their home countries be made more stable politically and economically? We have a Syrian refugee crisis that came due to the war in Syria. It's a migration wave or a migration weapon, and we have economic migration from Africa that will not just stop with our discussions and with closed borders.
Okay, thank you very much.
Could you please address that? And I would also like to have Dr. Hanning's perspective, because he published a lot on that.
Okay, well, should we start with Dr. Hanning?
Yes, it's a very difficult issue, because I've already mentioned we have this huge economic gap between Europe, parts of Africa, parts of Asia. And hundreds of millions of people are dreaming to have a standard of living like we are enjoying here in Europe. And we have to manage these problems, these expectations. And I think in the end of the day, yes, we have to achieve a better border control. We need in Europe, and I've already mentioned it, and in Germany, a clear migration policy, immigration policy. Maybe that we have to look to Singapore or elsewhere. But I think, again, this is one of the very huge challenges which we are facing here in Europe. And we are always discussing the problems. We should tackle the problems, solve the problems in the countries of origin. But looking to Afghanistan, we have tried to solve the problem in Afghanistan. We have not been very successful. Looking to Africa, we can't solve the problems in Somalia. We can't solve the problem in South Sudan. We can't really solve the problems in the northern part of Nigeria. I think, yes, we have to spend more money. We have to try our best to provide stability and to support the countries, but we can't do anything against bad governance. And looking to many states in the world, we have these problems of bad governance. We have the corruption problem and so on. Therefore, in the end of the day, I think, yes, we have to do both. We have to improve our border control. We have to try to stabilize the countries of origin. And, of course, we have to try to achieve proper immigration policy, not only in Germany, but all over Europe.
Can I bring in Paul and then Parag?
Yeah, so clearly, with migration from poor countries, who leaves? It tends to be the young, the enterprising, the skilled. That is privately rational for those people. As Robert said, they gained so much by it. It is, in aggregate, socially destabilizing. It damages the societies they leave. A society which loses a lot of its bright, educated young people, that is really damaging, right?
It depends how many, right?
I've got at the moment 3 African doctors as students at my public policy school. Right? One's Sudanese, and he actually plans to go back to work in the Prime Minister's office. But he tells me that there are more Sudanese doctors in London than in the entirety of Sudan. Right? That's because we in Britain ran our medical policy, our health service, so disgracefully. We wouldn't spend money training our own doctors. We poached them from an impoverished place like Sudan, which desperately needs those doctors, right? Robert, are you really celebrating the rise in GDP when a doctor leaves Sudan and becomes a taxi driver in London and earns more money. That is your doubling of GDP, global GDP, right? It is just not, it's not a sensible strategy.
That is.
But unfortunately, we've got very small doctors from Africa. Most of them are illiterate, are not educated, are not trained. That is the problem for our social system,
Now,
to be very frank.
Okay, what we can do, and I've been very proud that the last year I've been working very closely with the German government. The German government was president of the G20, so I was brought in by the German Ministry of Finance to help design their Africa initiative, which became the Compact with Africa, and that is trying to do what Europe and the rest of the developed world really, really should be doing, can be doing, to help Africa, which is bring our firms to Africa. What Africans desperately need is the enhancement in productivity that comes from what firms do naturally. Bring people together, scale and specialization, create the miracle of productivity. Africa is desperately short of proper firms.
But they don't go there.
Two-thirds of its educated people are working in self-employment. No scale, no specialization, doomed to poverty. We've got the firms, they've got the people. Rather than bring the people to the firms, it makes so much more sense to take the firms to the people.
There's a piece missing there, which I suspect you're about to tell us, but the reason the firms typically don't go to Africa is because the institutions and the rule of law are not what they are here.
And we don't run these countries anymore. So they...
Indeed not.
No, right. So nor, you know, we should really try and remember that, right? We shouldn't preach what they should do, right? That is really adding insult to injury. What we can do is use our public money to take a top slice of the risks that firms face by going places where they are desperately needed, where there's a big public interest in them going, but they can't get the benefit of that public interest. And so using aid to incentivize firms to go to places that at the moment they'd rather not go to, that's the best use of aid.
But the problem is, may I interfere? Companies are investing in stable African countries. They are investing in South Africa, they are investing in Kenya and elsewhere. They are not investing in Somalia, not in South Sudan, not in the Sahel. I think that's a problem, because nobody is investing in Somalia, for example. And we are getting a lot of refugees coming from Somalia.
You put it into context, and there is far more regional migration in sub-Saharan Africa than there is coming to Europe. And it's a particularly German fixation, this idea that there is a wall of people coming because of demographic change, as if it was a mathematical equation. And it's just not. It is a much more complex set of dynamics.
Absolutely.
If you are creating regional economic hubs, if you are creating, you know, if you are developing Ghana, or if you are developing these areas which could become real draws, as we've seen with South Africa, not necessarily that South Africa wants that, but you're now seeing that being a draw, as many people go south as go north from many countries. That's fine, as long as you're creating like opportunity and jobs and creating that circulation, and maybe creating free movement in Africa. Sorry, that's...
There's also another part. There's also another part to it.
It's, I think, you know, the answer to your question, in short, in 2 words, is world peace. That's how we solve all of this. World peace and
that's an excellent
2 more,
idea.
equality.
That does suggest more
but
questions.
we have to do a lot of very, very complex things. So fixating on one single solution is exactly where you find the problem. This is one of them. It's one of 20 different things you're going to have to do. The problem is, in Europe, we don't have the political will to even attempt 1 or 2 of them, let alone 20.
Well, actually, there's something else we can do, which is, you know, on top of what you're saying in terms of how do we encourage good governance and maybe have aid for governance in these countries, and rule of law and putting in property registers and all that sort of stuff that to give companies the confidence to go. It was said to me by a development economist once. He said, from one of the African countries, he said, the problem is you put up all these tariff and non-tariff barriers to our goods and services. Now, you've got a choice. You either take our goods or you take our people. And so actually something that we can all do is look at how we can reduce our trade barriers to many of those countries. But in terms of refugees, it's far more difficult, because what can you do? What you could do in a sort of imperialistic world is go into these countries, create a safe haven, you know, commit your soldiers and your defence forces, much to the disappointment of your electorate, and have a safe haven where people from those countries can move internally into the country, into a safe haven, but then you would be accused of imperialism. So it's very difficult in these failing states to actually do anything. But actually, some other countries, you know, we're relatively more stable. We could help build good governance to encourage the sort of investment you're talking about.
Okay, let's quickly have Parag.
Maybe you could stop for
Sorry.
Okay.
Well, I want to reinforce what Paul said, because we could think of a number of two-word pairs like economic development, foreign investment, less corruption, that would all contribute to this solution. But I do think if you look at, let's take large countries where the fear has subsided in terms of that wall of people coming into our country. So one would be Mexico, where in fact you have relative, almost neutral migration now, because you've had very high Mexican growth rates. You have a lot of Mexicans who've gone back to Mexico. The other is Turkey, right, where again, in the up through the 1990s in Germany, there was a huge concern that there's just an endless stream of Turks and Kurds and others. But in fact, it's not a problem today, because you've had high growth, you've had political stability, what's happening in Turkey right now notwithstanding, and even drug wars in Mexico notwithstanding. You generally have high growth, very large countries. They're absorbing their own back. The lesson is very, very clear, and that is that if you go back quarter century now to this Barcelona process, that was again one of these European declarations, statements, pacts, treaties, documents that's not worth the paper it was written on, even though it was 500 pages. Don't all Europeans wish they would go back 25 years to that Barcelona process? It was exactly 1992, I think, and really actually do it. And guess what it said? It said, let's invest in these economies, let's help them grow, let's disincentivize migration. And indeed, it's true, most human migration is south-south, right? So if you do create those hubs, magnets of growth in West Africa, East Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, people will inherently prefer to stay in their own geography, earn a good wage. They have internal remittances, just as you have within Africa, within South Asia, within China, and that would be a huge contributor, and we should really think about doing that. And the risk guarantees for sure for foreign investment are important, but it hasn't really happened at a large scale. The U.S. government itself tried to do this right after the Arab Spring. They created this Committee of 100, and Madeleine Albright and others chaired it, and they wanted to get 100 leading American companies to make investments, job-creating investments in Egypt and elsewhere. They all signed the document, but pretty much walked away. And I wonder if, because Paul is in his earlier work made it single-handedly, heroically acceptable to talk about infant industry protection, right, as economic development strategy. And I wonder if you think about it, since these are also, a lot of these large African countries are high-growth markets where Western companies really want to export their goods. They also want all these people buying iPhones and all this other stuff. What if these countries were to say, well, you've got to build some of the components here if you want to have unfettered access to our markets? I just leave that as a question mark, because I think that would be potentially something that would create the involuntary incentives, I guess.
The Chinese way.
It's the Chinese model, basically. I mean, India is doing this too now. Everyone is doing industrial policy. But industrial policy / market access restrictions as a way of forcing that investment to come in. I just wonder.
Actually, if you look at his FDI in the car industry in Europe, the EU had something called a voluntary export restraint, which wasn't voluntary at all. It just said Japan can only export so many cars to the European markets. And what the companies did in order to get around that was to engage in more FDI and more construction, or first of all, it's kits, and then more value added within the markets. Maybe that is a way to look at it, because it's been tried in a number of places.
We are nearly out of time. Can I give the last word to Elizabeth?
Really?
Yeah, unless you don't want it.
No,
Ravening wolves will jump in and take it from you if you don't want it.
Well, when it comes to immigration and workforce in Europe, what's been striking me the last 5 minutes, and what strikes me about many of these discussions, is there's an assumption that Europe will be unendingly attractive. We're changing quite fast as Europeans, demographically, in terms of our own economies. The UK is about to have an experiment in what happens to your attractiveness when you make a drastic change.
We'll be far more attractive to the whole world, not just white Europeans.
I desperately hope so.
Yeah.
But do we fully comprehend changing natures of regions and interregional relations? And we are perhaps a little short-sighted in making assumptions about European dominance over the next 20 years, and perhaps making assumptions about future migration flows in that context. So sometimes Europe is guilty of hubris, and I wonder what a less hubristic approach to future dynamics of migration might look like.
Well, you can project out you can have population projections that go out for 50, even if you're being fanciful, 100 years, but it's extremely difficult to predict what the world's going to look like then. Excellent. I'm afraid we have run out of time, so it behoves me to thank our distinguished panelists, Elizabeth Collett, Paul Collier, August Hanning, Syed Kemal, and Parag Khanna. Thank you all very much for coming and listening to the debate, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much indeed.